Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at a conversation that took place between Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins a little bit over a year ago. There are a lot of jokes about the conversation that can be found in the comment section of the video, where people are claiming that this was more of a Jordan Peterson monologue. I think Jordan Peterson was so excited about this opportunity to speak to Richard Dawkins that he didn't actually allow Richard the time to present his own ideas. That can happen. We're human. Nonetheless, there were some very interesting moments of this exchange. The title of the video is Psychedelics, Consciousness, and AI. These are all topics that I'm highly interested in myself. At this point, a lot of the content that is being watched more so is of the political variety, but I don't want to fully be pigeonholed into a political channel. I'm very much interested in these broader intellectual topics as well. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Well, I think we agree about this, so we ought to get on to whatever it is you want to talk about.
Yes. Well, I'd like to talk to you about your paper, the one you sent me about the organism as a model.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, if you don't mind, because I'd like to, I guess what I was curious about, because I didn't find anything in that paper that I disagreed with at all. I thought, yeah, and I know a little bit about the engineering literature that suggests that, and even the computational literature that suggests that in some sense, an organism that operates within the world has to be a model of that world.
Yes.
in order for it to be operate in the world.
Yes.
And you detailed out all sorts of real world examples, including, well, let's say stick insects, where not only are they a model of the world, but they look just like the world. And,
yes.
And animals in winter versus summer changing their coats. And birds, of course, you said you could derive the structure of the atmosphere and probably the Earth's gravitational field and probably the strength of the gravitational field by a sufficiently detailed analysis of the bird.
Very good. I hadn't noted that one. That's very good.
Yeah. Oh, well, you did mention the air aspect with birds, anyways. But I'm sure you could. I could
generalize that. Yes. Well, good. I'm glad you like that. It's a book I'm now working on called The Genetic Book of the Dead, which is all about the idea that the animal is a model of not the present but the past. It's a model of the ancestral worlds.
Yes.
Because the animal's genes have been filtered through a long series of environments. So the genome is a palimpsest of ancient environments, more recent,
right,
until very recent, including, and then we go out of the genome and the nervous system becomes part of the palimpsest of recent experience.
Right, so you could say that, correct me if I ever put words in your mouth, because I want to get what you think exactly right. The genetic code is a repository of information that generates perhaps ever more complex or ever more fine-grained.
I'm not trying to say that. All I wanted to say is that the genetic code is in principle decodable description of ancient environments.
Right. Okay, fair enough. So the question then, I suppose, would be, at what level of resolution, right?
Yes.
So there's this idea, I think I mentioned it in my talk the other day. I really like this idea. And when I talk about religious matters, by the way, I try to speak metaphorically and psychologically and to tread on ground that might be theological only when that's absolutely necessary, and never if I can possibly manage it. So I like to think about things in psychological and biological terms, and physical terms for that matter, wherever possible. It keeps things clearer and simpler. And so, but there is this idea in relationship to the idea of the incarnation, that Christ could embody God through a process of kenosis, and the scholastic theoreticians who made this case, because they were trying to account for how the entire cosmos, you might say, could fit in one body. And the idea was, well, there was an emptying of God. And when I was reading that in relationship to heuristic processing, and also to the idea of
I mean, this is one of the major criticisms that Jung levies against Christianity. It's at the beginning of Psychology and Alchemy. His criticism of Christians is that they often externalize Jesus as a figure. It's like, we need to follow Jesus, but we can never be like Jesus. And Jesus died for our sins so that we no longer have to be perfect. But in a way, I think Jung's criticism speaks to this idea that within each of us, there is this potential to live up to the ideal of Christ. I think that would appeal to Christians, but they wouldn't necessarily latch onto it in the sense that it actually places an onus of responsibility onto individuals to uphold something that to many Christians seems unreachable. Why externalize this figure as outside of your domain when you have the capacity to actually embody it? I think what Peterson alludes to when he discusses a spark of divinity inside people.
You know, Solzhenitsyn said, drawing on his Eastern Orthodox Christian background, every single person is the center of the world, a center of the world, not the center of the world. The world's a complicated place. It can have all sorts of centers. It's hard to believe that you might be one of them, but maybe it's too much to ask of people. But you know, our great religious traditions do continually remind us that inside every human being there's a spark of divinity.
That spark of divinity has been expressed in many different religious traditions. I think the term in Hinduism is paramatman to describe this ideal form of yourself that can be manifested and expressed in a sort of idealistic potentiality. That being said, this idea of the essence of the universe relinquishing its power, emptying its reservoir into a consolidated form of an individual, very much resonates with the theological research that I've done. Of course, when it comes to religion, a lot of this is speculation. Part of the issue that we have bridging science and religion right now is that they just function on different terms. My suggestion has been that we need to do more experiments with dissolving the boundaries between the material world and the spiritual domain. And perhaps the only way we can do that is through the intake of psychedelic drugs, in which the scientists themselves were prescribed doses of various psychedelics. We could come up with a whole new realm of science as to how their non-sober states relate to their sober measurements. And we could perhaps map it based on the individuals themselves. But the general idea is expanding the concept of empiricism beyond one cognitive state.
So the kenosis idea, part of the reason I'm interested in this, and I was extremely interested in the fact that when we first had our emails back and forth, before we decided to meet, I suggested that we meet and that I would like that. And you sent me an email and you said, I suspect you want to talk about this. And I thought, it was remarkable to me that you picked that particular paragraph, because that was exactly why I wanted to talk to you. And it was, I think, probably the most clearly I'd ever stated that particular idea. And so that was quite...
I've forgotten what that was.
Well, it has to do with what we're talking about to some degree. The question is, if the human being is a model of the environment, what exactly is being modeled? So, because you might ask, well, what exactly is the environment? Mm-hmm. And that's where I think we could have a very fruitful exchange of views. Now, the stick insect has obviously been shaped to a massive degree by natural selection because it looks like a stick. But I'm very curious about the role of sexual selection, because that makes things weirdly complicated, especially among human beings. Because, first of all, sexual selection can result in runaway processes. Like, I think I might have read this in your book, the Irish elk story.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and some people have suggested, and maybe it was you, because I read your books. It was a long time ago, but they stuck.
I'm laughing because you can sort of hear Richard a little bit exasperated there in the background as Jordan goes on these 5-6 minute spiels of pure monologue.
Suggested that at least one of the mechanisms that drove our rapid cortical evolution was stringent sexual selection, primarily applied by females to males.
I think that might be Geoffrey Miller who suggested that.
Okay. And so what if sexual selection is one of the processes that really drove our rapid divergence away from our chimpanzee human shared relative, then part of what we modeled as a consequence of that sexual selection is whatever women wanted. And so then the question is, what exactly is it that's driving human female sexual selection? And that's really what I wanted to talk to you about, because that would be incorporated in us as a model. You know, if women...
Well, there's many layers to it. And I think about something that I brought up on the channel before, the sort of dichotomy that Ayn Rand proposes between Attila and the witch doctor. The witch doctor being something that's wrapped up in the psychological world, optimizing for this escape from physical reality, whereas Attila is the manifestation of this physical brute that is intent on domination. I think different women are looking for different features within men. That's pretty obvious to say. There's a huge chunk of women that are interested in larger, muscular, physical, brutish types. It's why athletes are so widely viewed as these heroic models for masculine emulation, because they have this sort of physical prowess, and women can look at that and they can see capability. At the same time, there's another type of woman that I think is more interested in a masculinity that optimizes for linguistic proficiency. What is that prioritization that's taking place? Who are those individuals that are looking for a certain expression of masculine capability? Once again, there is a sort of divergence there between what the mainstream woman is looking for inside a man and what this kind of off-branched, less probabilistically relevant type of woman is looking for. And both of those are going to have an impact on evolution, theoretically, from a sexual selection perspective. Let's continue.
If women are looking for a kind of ideal, let's say, in a mate, then as they exercise their hypergamous choice, the male is going to come to ever more closely approximate that ideal, whatever it is. And that's going to be an implicit ideal, because none of that's conscious, obviously.
Yes. It seems to me you keep wandering from one subject to another without sticking to one at a time. I mean, we went to kenosis, and I kind of wondered what that had got to do with anything. And then
it's probably some difference in our thinking style. You know, I think, well, one of the... Would you say you're more interested in ideas or aesthetics?
Ideas.
Okay, that's what I would have guessed.
Yes.
I'm probably somewhat more interested in aesthetics, although it's close. And part of the way that would be reflected in our thinking styles is that I would think in a style that has a more loose associational structure.
That's right. I mean, let me take one example.
It's perfect. And the way that he articulates those differences of thinking is spot on. As I've shifted my own thinking away from a more atheistic version of myself toward embracing religious ideas, it's hard to explain if you've not been in both positions. The style of thinking has transformed completely. I still maintain friendships with people who are more atheistic in their bent, and I also have friendships blooming who are more religious in nature. And I've noticed these differences between the atheists being much more direct in the way they communicate, and more religious people tend to possess more of a loose associational structure. And maybe it is related to what Peterson is discussing regarding the contrast between interest in ideas versus an interest in aesthetics. But maybe those are different concepts too. Not sure.
It was something that I've seen of yours, which is nothing to do with sexual selection. You once showed in a lecture a picture of snakes spiraling around each other, snakes' tails.
Yes.
And you said something like, I think it's positively, that is a representation of DNA.
Yes, let's leave that one, but I promise I will return to that.
Well, let's run out of time, because that seems to me to go to the heart of what may be a difference between us, this aesthetic. I mean, that idea that in some sense represents DNA seems to me to be complete nonsense.
Okay, I will absolutely address that.
Okay.
God. Well, this is something I did want to talk to you about.
Okay,
it does take us rather far down the rabbit hole, though, I would say.
Okay. Well, I think it may be fundamental to our difference.
That's fine. I'm more than happy to address it. And people have called me out on that a lot. You know, and I actually threw that in a lecture because I was thinking in a loosely associative way about some very complicated things, and I was struck by this recurrence of the double helix pattern in cultural representations all over the place.
You love symbols. I mean, you're obsessed with symbols.
Yes.
You're almost drunk on symbols. and
you could say that.
I think you've got to stop and say, what does it actually mean to say?
Absolutely.
And the snakes twining is one thing. There are others, but
Based on the conversation, the way it's progressed so far, your discussion about the genetic code of animals in some way being a representation of past iterations of the universe. These ideas are very much connected. The idea that a symbol is more than just something that is outside of the domain of experience, that the symbols that we craft are linked with our experience itself, and they're linked with the unveiling of reality. Like even the postmodernists who Peterson likes to criticize, people like Derrida and Foucault, I remember that Derrida has something in very early chapters of his preeminent work of grammatology, where he discusses the crafting of truth as being an integration between the sign and signified. That part of what is representative of truth in Western metaphysics is the idea that there is some kind of sign or symbol that represents something, and the something itself that is represented sort of pulls at the significance of the sign. It like brings the sign into a sort of higher echelon of truth. The sign on its own doesn't mean anything when it's detached from the meaning of what it represents. But because it has meaning and because it has been crafted with this meaning over time, the importance of the sign is elevated. Then he goes on to talk about, well, which one actually came first? Was it the sign or the signified? And this sort of gets at the difference between Western thinking, where there's causation involved, versus Eastern thinking, where it's sort of a balanced pattern of equality that's represented by the yin-yang symbol. And there is no sequence. It's merely two sides existing simultaneously. I mean, this idea is represented in movies too, when you have characters that are envisioning the future, and the future is in essence pulling at the present or the past, and you can't have the present without the reference to the future. This is pretty abstract stuff, but there's a lot that we don't know about the universe, and there's a lot that is changed over time regarding what humans have experienced and how we conceptualize the truth. It should at least give our preconceptions pause.
But that would be a very good one to try to nail down.
Yeah, well, we could talk about technically for a moment, because I think it is a difference in thinking style. And I think one of the reasons that your writing is so appealing to people, including me, is that your language is very precise. It's very obvious what you mean when you say a given word, and some of the psychologists that I've really admired, like Jeffrey Gray, who wrote a great book on the neuropsychology of anxiety. Like, if you're interested in the idea of modeling, I think that's the most profound neuroscience text that's ever been written.
I haven't read that, I confess. I used to know Jeffrey Gray, but I haven't read that book.
It's a great book.
Yes.
And it integrates cybernetic theory and animal experimental work and neurophysiology and the function of emotion. Like, it's a really good book. And it is centrally concerned with the idea of modeling because Gray worked, see, in your paper, and I'll get to the DNA thing, I promise.
Okay.
In your paper, you talk about the response of a single cell to a repeated identical stimulus.
Oh, yeah, this is good stuff.
Sokolov, who was one of the great Russian neuropsychologists, identified the orienting reflex as the manifestation of the habituation phenomenon at the highest level of nervous system organization. So, for example, if I put headphones on you and then I hook you to a galvanometer and I play a middle C at exactly the same volume, 1 second apart, 40 times. Okay, so what'll happen is when you first hear it, there'll be a change in skin response. And then the second time you hear it, a slightly smaller change until it will habituate completely, zero response. But then if you change the volume or the pitch or the space between the tones, or, interestingly enough, if you skip a tone where the tone should have been and there's silence,
lovely,
you'll get an orange.
I like that.
Great. Okay. Now, out of that, the Russians hypothesized that you build an internal model, which is exactly what you say in that paper, and then your nervous system searches for deviations from the model. And then your consciousness is oriented towards the deviation. And it's oriented by a deep instinct, like literally an instinct. So, for example, if you're walking down the road, you have a map of the environment. Imagine that there's a loud clattering noise behind you. You'll stop, and this is all involuntary. It's driven by extremely low-level nervous system mechanism. So you orient towards the place of maximal novelty, and then you do rapid visual exploration to try to rehabituate yourself to the environment. And then if it's, a tradesman's truck bumped, you map that onto regularities you already know, and you continue onward. But all of that's mediated by emotion. So anxiety, literally, we wrote a paper on this, was one of the papers I'm most happy with, that anxiety signifies the emergence of entropy. That's what it does. So you can map anxiety right down to, well, you can map it right down to the level of entropy.
Oh man, this blends into a discussion of the psychedelic experience so well, because what ends up happening when you're in the heat of these trips is you're confronted with an enormous amount of novelty, and that novelty, especially when you're in the middle of a bad trip, is going to produce anxiety. Part of the reason why the novelty is anxiety provoking is because it's so out of this world. You have experiences when you're on psychedelics that just don't make any sense. You've never seen them before. They've never been artistically represented before. It's really art being experienced in real time, which is quite remarkable. I mean, it's one of the beautiful aspects of this experience, especially when it's done within the right settings. Part of the wonder of it is you're exposed to something that might not have occurred since you were very young, since you were a child. Adulthood, to a large degree, can become quite redundant because you think you've seen it all. Your wisdom that has been accumulated over time tends to result in boredom with life. I think a midlife crisis in its essence is this sort of boredom with the way that life has consolidated around a single form. You have a routine, you do the same thing every day, you go to the same job. It's not a particularly exciting job. There's not many new things that are taking place in your job, and it just lacks novelty. And humans need that novelty. We can't have too much novelty, or else we don't have any sort of internal map and we're directionless. But the novelty itself, in terms of building a higher resolution map, a more interesting map, a map with just more layers and more adventure, is critical to our own pursuit of enjoyment in this world. At least I think. A more nourishing fulfillment. I think religion can offer this to some extent. I think many religions are derived from the psychedelic experience. At the same time, I found that a lot of people who are atheistic and don't have this sort of connection to spirituality have never done psychedelics. And so if you've never done psychedelics and you're an atheist and you don't think that there's anything more out there, I gotta tell you, the only thing you need to try is something that will simply rewire your mind a little bit. And then you start to realize, well, maybe it's not all meaningless. Maybe there is some kind of internal wisdom within the whole thing. Or maybe there are aspects that are meaningless if you don't pursue the right paths, but there are paths that are flush with meaning. And why certain people end up suffering and certain other people don't, I mean, these are questions that we can ask for millennia, and we won't truly have an answer. Let's continue.
So anyways, Gray also mapped the emotions neuropharmacologically and neurophysiologically onto the orienting reflex. And then he identified the brain areas. So the hippocampus is extremely metabolically active. It's extremely expensive to operate psychophysiologically. It's very susceptible to oxygen deprivation and brain damage. The hippocampus moves information from short-term attention to long-term memory, and it's crucially involved in the analysis and inhibition of that orienting response. And you could also think too.
Brief side note, I have a hypothesis that the hippocampus is actually being progressively shrunk over time with excessive TikTok use. I think when you take these smaller and smaller snippets and you reduce people's attention span by habitually exposing them to just less and less information before you initiate the scroll, you are actually reducing people's ability to categorize information in a longer form way. This is a process that I view taking place where we're actually creating an underclass of people by farming their attention, reducing their conscious experience, and their increasing inequalities that will occur from this late stage of capitalism. But you can challenge that idea. It's just a speculation based on observations.
Too, that this movement of orientation, in some sense, your whole brain is set up to inhibit that. And so here's an interesting corollary of that. One of the things that psychedelics seem to do is to disinhibit. You called it lateral inhibition. There's also a phenomenon called latent inhibition, which is the inhibiting effect of the memory of the regularities on your current perception.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the world, mostly what you see is memory. And that's been tracked in the visual system.
Yes.
So, there are these visual primitives like line detection.
Yeah.
But if you look at the layers of the visual system, and you look at the bottom layer where the retinal cells first make contact with the visual cortex, there are more top-down inputs from the cortex into that low level than there are retinal inputs. So even at the level of initial detection, most of what you see is memory.
I think he's actually expanding on certain experiments I've heard referenced. There's this guy, Richard Gregory. He did experiments on the visual cortex. He found that there are certain receptors that are inclined to perceive lines at many particular angular varieties, but the orientation and the density of the receptors actually changes the visual information that's being experienced. And perhaps that could be a reason why, for example, cultures in the West perceive right angles in a more linear way, whereas cultures in the East perceive the right angles as more curvilinear. That might be a representation as to whether we see the boundaries of truth here in the West in a more finite way versus people in the East, where it's more just flowing energy. Actually, I'll save that for later, because we're about to get into
memory
the
inhibits the novelty response. And the novelty response, this is part of the reason I got interested in mystical experience.
No, never mind. I'm too excited. I have to share this. This is sort of an added layer to Peterson's discussion of interlocking snakes as taking the form of DNA. Very speculative idea, admittedly. But I also think the yin-yang symbol, the fact that the barrier between the yin and the yang is this curvilinear form that could be perceived as a snake, for instance. It represents the East's comfort with the transgressing of boundaries, that there isn't just good and evil, heaven or hell. There is a boundary that needs to be crossed and integrated, whereas the snake here in the West is explicitly seen as something that's demonic and evil, and the pathway toward this perverted reality, this fall from heaven, and that the snake is a manipulative figure. In the East, it's very well known that the Chinese are fond of their dragons, and they're definitely fond of their snakes as well. The snake in different cultures is a symbol of wisdom. It's not a symbol of treachery and duplicitousness. It might merely be a series of coincidences, but I think the coincidences are so clear and they line up so beautifully that it no longer seems like a coincidence.
The novelty response is twofold. It's not just anxiety. It's also exploratory curiosity. And that's because when there's something novel, well, you have to be careful, because God only knows what it might be. Like, it might be the thing that kills you. It might be nothing. So anxiety freezes you, but the hypothalamus, which sits right on top of the spinal cord and is the highest integrating center of the instinctual responses of the motor system. It's way precortical. It's divided into two parts. And one part of it governs the dopaminergic system that mediates incentive reward, so all positive emotion, but more importantly, active exploration. And so what happens if you hit something that's novel in relationship to the notions of preconceived regularities? Positive emotion is disinhibited. That's exploration. And negative emotion is disinhibited simultaneously. And there's a man named Rudolf Otto who wrote a book called, I can't remember the name of the book, but not Varieties of Religious Experience, because that's James.
William James.
Anyways, he described the primordial act of perception as numinous, mysterium tremendum. And it's a combination of positive and negative emotion. And I thought,
Yeah.
that's pre-latent inhibition perception. Psychedelics disinhibit latent inhibition of perception. And that's why they produce a mystical experience. But the mystical experience, I mean, there's three aspects to it, let's say. There's an overwhelming positive emotion. Simultaneously, there's overwhelming negative emotion. And that's like an awe experience. And then there's the disinhibition of fantasy simultaneously, which is something like the attempt to map that. And so people find that absolutely overwhelming. But by definition, it is overwhelming, literally. Now, you might say, so I'm going to answer that snake question. That's what I'm trying to do, I studied one symbol, which was the Scandinavian world tree symbol. And so the Scandinavians thought that there was a tree at the center of the cosmos. They called that Yggdrasil. And on the outside of the tree, there's a snake that eats its own tail. Now, the Amazonian jungle dwellers who discovered ayahuasca have the same image. It's exactly the same. It's a tree at the center of the cosmos with a snake that eats its own tail. Now, ayahuasca is a very bizarre chemical, and no one has any idea how the natives synthesized it.
Oh, yeah, this one.
Ayahuasca is a combination of DMT, which is an extremely powerful hallucinogenic that only lasts 10 minutes, and a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which makes the DMT experience last 8 hours, because monoamine oxidase inhibitors stop the breakdown of DMT, which is a monoamine. The Amazonians had to find these two plants that were widely separated geographically out of like hundreds of thousands of plants, and they had to mix them together, and they had to boil them properly for a certain amount of time to make ayahuasca. Well, they've been using ayahuasca probably for like 15,000 years. Now, the Scandinavians didn't use ayahuasca, the ones who came up with the world tree.
15,000 years?
For 15,000 years, yeah.
In Amazonia?
In the jungles. Well, they got there about 15,000 years ago. Now, maybe, we don't know how long it took them to discover it, but in most of those relatively primordial and small tribal groups, the pattern is unbroken oral tradition. Like, they're not transformative societies. They do pretty much what their ancestors did.
Okay, so you have a phenomenon which is something in common between Scandinavian and Amazonian.
Yes.
So do you have an explanation for that?
Yes.
I mean,
I would say the explanation...
Are you talking archetypes now?
Well, we won't get to that yet, because like I said, and I'm sure you would appreciate this, we want to keep things as...
I remember some discussion from Terence McKenna. He was talking about the idea, this references Jordan discussing how these Amazonian tribes were able to locate both plants responsible for synthesizing ayahuasca. McKenna also relayed some information about a plant that seemed to point in the direction of another plant. The psychedelic experience that was generated from one plant relayed the message of a geographic location for another plant. At least that was what the story was. It's almost like the plants themselves were linked in that the psychedelic production of one pointed in the direction of the other, which is a fascinating idea. I mean, it's not just talking about a connection between something and the basis of it being the same species, but it's a connection between plants in how they interact with our own senses. Like, that seems like an example of a symbiotic relationship almost, if I'm using that correctly. I don't have a scientific background. My fiance does. She works in a lab. So sometimes I speak in very loose associative ways, and she has to correct me on things. But, we're all trying out here. If there are any scientists watching and I'm not quite being precise enough with my language, leave a comment down below. I'll try to get to that.
much on the ground as possible.
Certainly,
right?
yes.
Yes, okay. Well, so it's not unreasonable to note that a particular chemical might have the same effect on widely distributed people. Right, so, okay, so you'd expect constancy of response to a pharmacological agent rather than variance.
Yes.
And that's even true with the psychedelics. And psilocybin, for example, almost all the psychedelics have a very similar chemical structure. It's a peculiar ring structure, but it's similar to LSD, psilocybin,
it's not that
DMT,
peculiar,
the classic hallucinogens.
It is very similar.
Psilocybin tends to produce a type of vision that has a fair bit of commonality across cultures. And you can think about that as, well, it's the psychophysiological effect of the drug. Now, it's weird because it has this emotional effect. And this disinhibition of emotion can go two ways, because people can have heavenly experiences, say that's almost complete disinhibition of positive emotion, or they can have bad trips, that's hell, essentially. That's complete disinhibition of negative emotion. And a lot of that seems to depend on the context within which they have the experience. So if there's a lot of negative things happening in that context, that can be magnified by the experience, and things can go like horribly sideways. That accounted for a lot of what happened badly in the psychedelic explosion in the US in the 60s. And that was precipitated by the discovery of LSD. And also, there was a mycologist who was a banker, who went into Mexico and found a woman practicing shaman who used psilocybin mushrooms, and she agreed to let them try them. And that was one of the, Soma, he wrote Soma, very famous book on Amanita muscaria. I can't remember his name at the moment. Wasson, that was Wasson. He was the first person. He introduced psilocybin mushrooms into Western culture. And like, we weren't ready for any of that. And certainly we weren't ready for LSD, because these are unbelievably powerful pharmacological. Like LSD,
Okay.
I think.
I have to stop here because I have things that I have to do, but I thought you would enjoy this part of the conversation. If you're interested in this, we can finish the interview and we can do a part 2 of this discussion, because this is really the stuff that I'm into. So I hope you guys enjoyed both the discussion between Peterson and Dawkins and whatever I was able to contribute. There's a lot more here, including a discussion about the significance of the tree as far as it relates to our own perceptions. A lot of truth in terms of how it branches ends up taking the form of a tree, and perhaps it's not a coincidence that that was our habitat before we were land-dwelling mammals. I mean, the earliest forms of mammals were Purgatorius, ironically named, which existed, I think it was 65 million years ago. I think that was the very beginning of Purgatorius. Ironically, the same time frame where the asteroid hit Earth and destroyed the dominant reptilian form on the planet, the dinosaurs. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll definitely do a follow-up if there is request. Take care.